Hey guys, so we have made it to the last lecture of the school year. Try to hide all of your sadness. I know you're so sad that we're done with these lectures. But anyway, last time we left off talking about Andrew Johnson and the steaming pile of crap that his presidency was. And we left off with the radical Republicans finally starting to stand up to him and wanting to, you know, get him out of office by any means necessary. So today we're going to pick up with the goals of the radical Republicans and when they took over Reconstruction. So by the end of this lecture, we want to be able to explain the goals of radical Reconstruction, but then why Reconstruction ended up ending. So let's just jump into it and just follow along with your notes and pause when you need to. Okay. So let's start with this origins of the civil rights. So you always hear about the civil rights movement, but where did this originate from? It wasn't in the 50s, the 1950s, or the 1960s. It was the 1860s, 1870s. So we start off with this difference between moderate and radical Republicans. So the difference between the moderates and the radical Republicans. So you need to know that the most Republicans were actually moderates. So they weren't all for civil rights for former slaves. They weren't for, radically changing the country. They were just kind of moderate, kind of in the middle. Couldn't make up their mind. So most moderates hated Johnson. So they hated Andrew Johnson, the president, but they were okay with working with him. They were like, all right, he's horrible, but let's just work with him. But they did so because they feared that the country wouldn't accept black voting rights. So the only reason that they were really working with him is because they themselves, and they figured the rest of the country wasn't ready to have black voting rights. Not that, they just fought a civil war that ended up being fought to end slavery or anything like that, but, they thought that, the country wouldn't accept black voting rights. That was just too much. So we get to the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. So that's where the moderates tried to compromise with Andrew Johnson. So this 1866 bill, clearly defined that all people born in the United States are citizens. So whether you were born a slave or not, as long as you were born in the United States, you were considered a citizen. And so this made equality clear and said that the black codes were illegal. We talked about the black codes in the last lecture and how that was like the way of the Southerners to reinstate slavery in a different form. So this new Civil Rights Bill of 1866, it made black codes illegal. But there were some issues with it. While it made, African Americans clearly citizens and pushed for equality, it did not mention one thing about black voting rights. And that's the main thing. That's where you get your power from, is being able to vote, have your voice heard. And it didn't mention one thing. So Johnson, he made his reply, and this was his reasoning. So this is where we just kind of go off the hinges even more with Andrew Johnson. He shocked the country by vetoing both of these bills. So, when he first came into office, he said, oh, I'm going to work with the Republicans. I'm going to be the great person for the black people. And yet he ended up vetoing this whole bill, both of them. And he said, this was his reasoning. He said that it gave the federal government too much power and said that black people just didn't deserve the right to citizenship. So taking a complete 180 from where he was originally, he said, I'm going to just say states' rights, and black people don't deserve to be citizens. And so to get even more crazy, he said it discriminated against white people. So let me repeat that. He said it discriminated against white people. That's called caucasity. He, not thinking about the last 200 years before that of how, slavery started in North America and all that, but we're not going to talk about that. He said that it was discriminatory against white people. And so this is how Congress responded to Andrew Johnson. This is when Congress actually stood up to horrible presidents. But anyway, this was the first time ever that they overrode his veto. So the president vetoed the bill, but as we learned in our Constitution unit, Congress can override a president's veto. So this was the first time this has ever happened. They overrode his veto and made the Civil Rights Bill of 1866 a law. And this was the first step of Andrew Johnson kind of his unraveling, his undoing. This was the first step. So we get to this thing called the 14th Amendment. So this is where Congress starts their own version of Reconstruction, which is known as Radical Reconstruction. So the 14th Amendment, what we need to know is that it gave citizenship to all citizens. All citizens now have citizenship, regardless of race. So this empowered the federal government to protect that very right. So instead of relying on the states to enforce it and, care for everybody out of the goodness of their heart, because that totally works. This said the federal government had the authority to do it. But this still did not guarantee the Black people to have the right to vote. This still did not guarantee that. So, but it did give a choice to the South. It gave the South a choice, Southern states a choice. It said the South had to allow Black men to vote to be able to keep that level of representation that they had in Congress. So you know how all the House of Representatives give, each state gets a certain amount of House of Representatives based on their population. So Congress said this to the South, to all these Southern states: if you do not allow Black people the right to vote, then you'll lose your representation in Congress. So, that's really powerful. The South wanted to have a voice again in Congress. And they said, well, unless you allow them to have the right to vote, you're just going to lose representatives. So they gave in. So we get to the Reconstruction Act of 1867. So this was one of these main goals of, we're talking about the motives for radical Reconstruction. So Andrew Johnson, talking about the Reconstruction Act. So Johnson continues to urge the South to refuse to adopt this 14th Amendment. So, all the states have to ratify, majority of the states have to ratify an amendment for it to go into the Constitution. So Andrew Johnson completely undermines everything the Republicans are doing and are urging the states to refuse to ratify it, to refuse to pass it. So he's urging the South to refuse to pass the 14th Amendment. But Congress passes this thing called the Reconstruction Act of 1867. And this split the South. So no longer were they just states. It split the South into 5 military districts. So they weren't just independent states anymore, or states that could make their own decisions. They said, you know what? Y'all aren't doing what you're supposed to do to get back into the Union. So we're going to split you up into military districts and have the federal government take control of these areas. So they called for the creation of new state governments that would allow Black people the right to vote. So they said, to get rid of, we're going to send in the soldiers, the military, and they're going to control these districts, which are like groups of southern states. And until you pass in your state government a constitution that allows Black people the right to vote, we're going to leave soldiers here until that happens. So we want to talk about motives for radical Reconstruction. Why do the radical Republicans want to do this? The first thing is that there was more and more demands by former slaves to get the right to vote. They're like, hey, isn't that what this whole war was fought for? If we're equal, we should have the right to vote. We're paying taxes. We're doing this. We're doing that. We're doing this. We can do all this. Why can't we have the right to vote? It's a crazy concept. So that's the first thing. It was a demand by the former slaves to have the right to vote. And so also the radical Republicans were pushing for equality. So they're motivated when their own people are pushing for equality. They also really just hated Andrew Johnson. I mean, how could you not? But they really just hated Andrew Johnson. And the last motive for the radical Reconstruction was that they wanted to prevent ex-Confederates from being able to get back into Congress. So these Southerners and Andrew Johnson are pushing to get the Confederates back into Congress, which, completely blows my mind still. But they wanted to get the Confederates back into Congress and get them their power back, which is the whole reason, Anyway, so that was their last motive. They wanted to get rid of prevent all ex-Confederates from going back into Congress. So we're moving on to this impeachment of Andrew Johnson, excuse me. Andrew Johnson. I keep getting that mixed up for some reason. I don't know why. But the impeachment of Andrew Johnson over Edwin Stanton. Okay. So Congress was sick of Andrew Johnson. They were finally just sick of him. I mean, how could you not be? So they were just sick of Andrew Johnson. So they ended up passing this thing called the Tenure of Office Act. The Tenure of Office Act. So this prevented Andrew Johnson from removing any cabinet member without the Senate approving. So Andrew Johnson could not remove any cabinet member. Remember, the cabinet members are like the group of people that the president appoints to be his advisors, sort of. So they're kind of over these different parts of the government. So the Tenure of Office Act, that prevented Andrew Johnson from being able to remove a cabinet member without the Senate approving it. And Andrew Johnson, being Andrew Johnson, he refused to obey it, and he removed the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. So Johnson refuses to obey the Congress, and he removed Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War. He was also a radical. So the House responded with articles of impeachment. So crazy. The president's refusing to do something that he's required to by law. The House impeaches him for high crimes and misdemeanors. Crazy concept. Anyway, so the House responded with articles of impeachment. So the last thing you need to know for this section is that while all the Republicans hated Andrew Johnson, not all of them wanted to have him removed. So, a lot of the Republicans, every Republican essentially hated Andrew Johnson, but not all of them wanted to remove him. So we get to our results. Andrew Johnson's getting worried. He's like, oh crap, I'm about to be the first president ever to be removed from office. And he knows that he's not going to run again. He knows that he's not going to ever get reelected because even, he just realizes there's no chance. So he promised to stop interfering with Reconstruction if they would acquit him or drop the charges of impeachment. So he promised to stop interfering, and I'll just ride out the rest of my time in office, which was like less than a year, if Congress would acquit him, the Senate would acquit him. And so the Senate voted 35-19 for acquittal, 35-19 to acquit him. And that was one vote short. Or, excuse me, the Senate voted 35-19 to convict him. 35-19 to convict him. But they needed 36 votes to convict him. So they were one vote short. One vote short of convicting him. And it's actually a Republican that voted to acquit him. That's another rant for another day, but long story short, that Republican was bribed a lot of money, and he voted to acquit him even though he knew that he was guilty. So they needed 36 votes to remove Andrew Johnson from office, and they only got 35. So Andrew Johnson's realizing, all right, I got a couple of months left in office. I can't really do much because the Congress hates me. Both parties hate me. So we get to this thing, the 15th Amendment. So we passed the 13th, abolish slavery. 14th Amendment, citizenship. 15th Amendment. This was the third and final amendment passed during Reconstruction. So there were 3 amendments passed during Reconstruction. This was the third and final one. So it prevented any government, any state government, or any government at all, federal or state, from denying any citizen the right to vote. So we finally have an amendment giving African Americans the right to vote. It denied any government the right to prevent people from having their right to vote. But there were two big loopholes. Of course, that would be too easy just for something to just be passed and work. There's always these things behind the scenes. So these loopholes allowed Southern states to restrict voting based on literacy, poll taxes, and different tests. So essentially, all right, yeah, you can vote. Yeah, everybody has a right to vote. We're sticking with it. But you have to be able to read this passage. And if you can't read, you can't vote. Or you have to pay this tax to be able to vote. So that's where it gets interesting, because, most former slaves, they were slaves and they weren't allowed to read. So a lot of the majority of African Americans and poor white people were illiterate. They couldn't read, so they couldn't vote. So the South, white Southerners knew that, and they knew that that was their way of getting around the 15th Amendment. So yeah, hey, we're sticking with the law. We're letting people vote, but they just have to be able to read. And then they should be able to pay a tax. We got to be able to pay for all these things. We're rebuilding from the war. Sounds kind of familiar, kind of like Southern states today passing these, voter registration laws, ID laws. You have to have an ID. Okay, yeah, gotta have an ID. Okay, well, you also were going to close down all these different courthouses except for these main ones, and they're only open from 8 to 5. But I don't get off until 5. How am I going to register? That's not my problem. So, same old crap, just a different day, and it's all in the South still. There's still voter suppression to this day. That's the reason that Stacey Abrams is not the governor of Georgia. She, right before the election, the guy that's the governor now of Georgia, the Republican, Kemp, he was the Secretary of State while he was running. The Secretary of State is in charge of elections. Right before the election, 53,000 people were written off of, lost their right to vote because they said that they weren't up to date on their information in Georgia. 53,000 people. Guess how many votes Stacey Abrams lost by? 50,000 votes. So she lost that election. She had it stolen from her, essentially. But I digress. So, two shortcomings. It allowed the Southern states, the two shortcomings of the 15th Amendment, it allowed the Southern states to implement these tests and these different taxes and tests to prevent or to restrict voting. And then the second thing is that it completely overlooked women getting the right to vote. So not only were African Americans being kept from voting, or whites being able to keep from voting, now they also kept women from having the right to vote. That's a major block of people. Okay, so now, almost at the end, Radical Reconstruction in the South. So Radical Reconstruction, we talked about it on a national level. Now let's look at it in the Southern, just in the South. So the Reconstruction Act, it gave a great amount of political activity grew from this. So, people were able to participate in politics at a level never seen before, mainly African Americans, because they finally had the right to vote. So 5 years after the Civil War, all of the former Confederate states were back into the Union and under Republican control. So keep that in mind. The Republican Party just came into existence in 1850. So what? 20 years earlier, the Republican Party didn't even exist. And so now in 1870, 5 years after the Civil War ended, all of the Southern states were back into the Union, and they were under Republican control. And keep in mind, this is not the Republicans of today. That's completely different. And so, this is a monumental shift, and this is allowing a ton of people that had never had their voices heard, now had their voices heard. So as we're going through this Reconstruction unit, I mentioned at the very beginning that Reconstruction was this period that could have been a monumental change to our country. And some people claim it was a great success. All these amendments were passed. Black people were given the right to vote. They were become citizens. Yes, 100%. But did it go far enough? While it was great in some areas, it completely bombed in other areas. So we want to be able to answer that question of, was it a success or a failure by the end of these notes? We're going to be able to look back over all our notes and kind of think about it. Anyway, Black power in Reconstruction. So there were, like I mentioned earlier, there were large amounts of African Americans that now had their voices heard, but they also were able to rewrite each state's constitution. They had the ability to take part in rewriting the state's constitution to allow them to vote. And so the Black people in the South made up the majority of the Republican Party, but yet they still did not get access or control of Reconstruction policies. So while they were still the majority in the South and in the Republican Party, they still didn't have a voice or control of Reconstruction politics. They only could make up a small group of those in power. So the Southern Republicans in power. And so the Southern Republicans, they're being swept in, they're in control of every state in the South. But think about this. Just because they're in power, does that still mean that the South likes them? No. So the Southern Republicans, they faced opposition ever since they faced opposition from their white elites the entire time that they were in power. So think about this. It's like being in power, but you have both hands tied behind your back, and you're still supposed to be able to fight somebody. That's how it was. So the Southern Republicans, they were in power, but yet they faced opposition the entire time that they were in power. But one of the greatest achievements that happened during this time was that public schools became a major force in the South, and not just the public schools that were defunded to prevent Black people from being able to go to school. This is now the Republicans are in charge. They're making a great stride in the public school systems. The main reason that our public school systems look the way they do today, for the most part, is because of what happened during Reconstruction. And so they were also able to push major pieces of civil rights bills through. They were able to pass many amendments. They were able to pass many different bills that became civil rights bills. So, like we mentioned, there's some great things right there. But just like anything, anytime there's great progress in our country, there's always going to be backlash. There's always going to be fighting back by backward people. Obama was elected president. Racism should have ended, right? Right? No? What? No. Donald Trump then gets elected after 8 years of Obama being in office, and we're where we're at now with this, what we call administration. But anyway, so the end of Reconstruction, the South fights back. So why were they wanting to fight back? Why were they so against all of this? We're rebuilding the South, but we can't have that. So the main thing is that Southern elites and Democratic politicians hated Reconstruction. So the elites in the South and the Democratic Party, they hated Reconstruction because they saw it as Black supremacy. They saw it as Black people taking over. So we can't have that. So they also hated higher taxes because these higher taxes, they raised taxes, which, okay, I can somewhat understand you not liking that you're paying high taxes because are the elites paying any high tax? No. It's the middle and lower class that are paying the higher taxes, but yet they're making it out to seem like, oh, well, it's the Black people that you're having to support, which is why they were so against it. They said they refused to pay the higher taxes because they knew that those taxes were going to build public projects that would allow Black people to integrate with white people. So the Southerners, they were like, no, I'm not paying these high taxes to allow Black people to sit beside me on a railroad car. Or it's going to allow Black people the right to vote. Why would I pay these taxes to support that? So the Southerners, they fight back. They're like, no, they're refusing to do it. They're angry. They're looking for a way to get rid of these Republicans. And so the last thing I want you to see is that the main reason that all this boils down to is that many Southern whites just couldn't accept Black people being equal to them. Crazy concept that, people being equal, what? But the main reason was that white people in the South just couldn't accept Black equality. And so they had to fight back. And that's when we get to our last couple of sections, what's known as the Reign of Terror. Not the French Revolution with Robespierre, but the Reign of Terror. So this was, the goal was to create enough violence to end the Republican rule in the South. So the goal was to create enough violence that we were able to end Republican rule in the South. That's what they're pushing for. These Southern white people are tired of all this that we just mentioned. Why were they so angry? They're wanting to fight back now and create enough chaos and violence that the Republicans will just leave. And so in the early years of Reconstruction, racial violence was very unorganized and it was only at the local level. So I'm not saying it wasn't bad, because there were many people killed, but it wasn't like a complete organized unit. It was just like local areas of violence and like small towns and stuff like that. And so the main reason that African Americans were attacked and killed because they had the audacity to challenge the status quo and assert their rights. So the white people in the South couldn't deal with that. So they were challenging the status quo, so they had to put that down. But then 1867 happens. We had the Reconstruction Act, we had the Civil Rights Bill Act, and so after 1867, violence ended up spreading out across all of the South because it was now motivated by politics. So with this Reconstruction Act and splitting up the South and the federal government taking control of the South, Southerners had finally had enough, and the violence became political violence. They saw, okay, we can't get rid of them by just scaring them off, so now we've got to get political and use politics to help get rid of them. So that's where we get to the birth of the Ku Klux Klan. So we get to the birth of the Ku Klux Klan. We've talked about it a good bit before, but just a quick rundown, it was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee, and that was in 1866. So the Klan, the main thing you need to know is that they were a terrorist, yes, I said terrorist, organization, and they were founded to be like the military force of the Democratic Party. So they were like the enforcers of the Democratic Party. They were founded to be that military force behind the Democratic Party to ensure that any goal of the Democratic Party was achieved. So, like intimidation, attacking. So they were led by Southern elites and Democratic politicians that tried to act like they were just, quote, quote, protecting Southern women. So they were led by the Democratic Party and the elites in the South, and they said, oh no, we're not trying to, we just want to protect our Southern white women and our way of life. They claimed that, these horrible, violent Black men were threatening to rape our women and attack our women. And so we've got to protect our Southern women. That's the whole point of us Ku Klux Klan, us a bunch of random guys riding around in white sheets. We just want to protect our Southern white women. So why cover yourself up? Well, yeah, well, I digress. But anyway, so the goal was to get Black people and Republicans mainly out of power by any means necessary. So their goal was to get rid of Reconstruction Republicans and any groups of Black people that were asserting their right to vote by any means necessary. So they were trying to just take things back to the way they were. So an example I gave you was in Colfax, Louisiana. The Colfax Massacre is what it became known as. So that was where former Confederates assaulted this town of Colfax in Louisiana, and they murdered hundreds of former slaves. So this militia, essentially, of former Confederates attacked this town. They had old cannons and everything from the Civil War. And they murdered hundreds of former slaves, and the majority of them were killed after they had surrendered. All because they had the nerve to want to push for the right to vote and for their equal treatment. Literally. Okay, last two things. The Enforcement Act. So all this violence is breaking out across the South, and the states can't control it. So the states ask the federal government for help. It's crazy. These states are all for states' rights until something bad happens. And they're like, oh, we need the federal government. Oh, but I thought you want small government. Let the states handle it. No. We need help now. Crazy. So the states asked President Grant, who has now taken over after Andrew Johnson didn't even bother running for president again because he knew he wasn't going to get elected. So President Grant, he is asked for help by the states because the southern states can't handle all the violence breaking out. And so Congress passes the Enforcement Act. And that's what it outlawed terrorist organizations. So it outlawed the Ku Klux Klan. So if you remember, you were breaking the law, a federal law. And it gave President Grant the power to use the army to stop any violence. So if they're hear of a rebellion breaking out or violence in the South, President Grant can send the military down there to stop it, or he can use the National Guard to stop it. And so hundreds of members of the Klan ended up fleeing the South and running away. And if they didn't flee, they were arrested and put on trial, which that's great, And it led to the Klan collapsing and dying, or so we think. But did it really? Like hundreds of people were arrested and put on trial. That's great. But only less than 50 were convicted. And if they were convicted, they went to prison for 6 months, a year? Okay? Don't you do that again, essentially. So, the Klan collapsed and died, but did it really? If the whole society in the South had hatred in their heart, what is a piece of paper like the Enforcement Act? Is that going to magically, okay, I signed the Enforcement Act. Is that going to end racism? Is that going to end hatred? No. It's just still simmering there, which is why we had all these issues that continued in the South. The hatred never ended. It was just, they just said, oh, well, we signed the paper and it's over with. Hey, great. Kind of like the coronavirus, you could say. All these states are opening back up. Do you think the coronavirus really cares about if a government says that we can go back out? Oh, well, I'm going to stop infecting people because the government says, well, we need to open back up for the economy. So the coronavirus is going to stop infecting people? That's like the logic of people today. But anyway, so yeah, the Klan collapsed and quit being a force, but it never really went away. It was just sitting there simmering, and that hatred is still in those people's hearts, which is why it resurged in the 1920s and why it resurged in the 1960s and why we still have these hate groups today. Last thing, last note section of the entire year. Reconstruction ends. So the end of Reconstruction. So we get to the 1870s. And by the 1870s, the Northern commitment and the overall federal government commitment to Reconstruction had started to fade away. So there's three big reasons why Reconstruction comes to an end. So we're thinking back to our learning goal. We want to talk about the goals of Radical Reconstruction, but then we also want to talk about why Reconstruction ended up being a failure. Or, excuse me, why Reconstruction ended up ending. First thing, all the radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner had ended up dying. They died off. They were old. They'd either died off or left office. And their replacements were less worried about civil rights. They didn't care about civil rights. And they didn't want to use the federal government to worry about it. So the first thing, radical Republicans ended up dying off and leaving office, and their replacements, they weren't worried about the same things that radical Republicans are worried about. Second thing, these Democrats start to take back power in the South because the Republicans have been in charge for so long. So the Democrats start to get reelected all across the South by using voter suppression tactics like the Klan. They were known as redeemers. They were known as redeemers. They were able to take back control of the South, and they reclaimed Southern way of life for the white. They reclaimed the South for white people is what they call it. So they said, you know what, we're done with Reconstruction. We are reclaiming our land. We're reclaiming the South for the white race. And so your last thing is the 1876 election. So this 1876 election, it was known as the corrupt bargain. And so that was where the Republicans, the ones who were pushing for equality and rights and black people the right to vote, the Republicans agreed to end Reconstruction, so they essentially sold out to be able to win the presidency in 1876. So this is how far we came away from the original goal. Right after the Civil War, the Republicans were the ones who were pushing for these federal laws to guarantee everything that had been fought for in the Civil War. But yet, 10 years after the war ended, 11 years after the war ended, you had Republicans, stop worrying. They give up on fighting for civil rights. They give up on all the things that they had set out to accomplish. And using the federal government, they said, you know what, we're going to let the states worry about it. Then the Redeemer Democrats start to take back control of the South because the Klan is still allowed to roam free, essentially, and racial violence and intimidation is able to roam free. And then it culminates into this 1876 election that was known as the corrupt bargain. And that's where the Republicans literally sold out to be able to get the presidency. So those are your three big reasons why Reconstruction ended. So you wonder, why would the Republicans just, make a deal to win an election? How did that happen? So in 1876, Grant decided not to run again. And so this guy, Rutherford B. Hayes, was nominated on the Republican side. And on the Democrat side, this guy named Samuel Tilden was nominated. It was a very close race. So close that they had to go back and recount the votes in three big states: Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. All southern states. Isn't that something? It's almost like there was so much corruption and voter intimidation by white supremacist groups that they didn't know who actually won in those states. So it goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Finally, this group of Republican and Democrat senators get together and they say, all right, so Samuel Tilden probably isn't going to end up winning these states overall. Not going to end up winning. So how about this? Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, he'll be president. We'll allow it. But in return, all federal troops have to leave the South and end Reconstruction, give power back to the southern states. And the Republicans are so worried about getting in office again and remaining president, they sell out. So all of this hope and change that we could have had ends up dying. And Reconstruction ends before they complete the mission. And that was that. And so the minute that the federal troops leave, what do you think's going to happen? But wait, we signed the Enforcement Acts and all of this that ended all this violence. Okay, what does a piece of paper mean? So right when the federal troops pulled out, a whole new wave of violence broke out across the South. And these Redeemer Democrats took power and started to undo every single thing that the Republicans had fought for during Reconstruction. So everything that happened during Reconstruction started to try and get chipped away at little by little. All these different poll taxes and stuff like that we mentioned. Yeah, they had all these amendments, but there were so many loopholes that did they have really any teeth behind it? So we started out at the beginning of this unit talking about how Reconstruction was supposed to be this great time of change. And in many ways it was. But did we go far enough? Did the people in charge, those in charge, push far enough to create radical change in this country that allowed a whole new group of people the right to vote? I mean, think about it. At that time, they could have easily had, it's called enfranchisement, where a whole new block of voters, African Americans, could have had the right to vote. Women could have gotten the right to vote. Did that happen? No, women didn't get the right to vote until 1920. So what, 70, 80 years later? 60 years later? So I mean, this could have been a period of radical change, but yet hatred, racism, and elites got in the way to prevent the will of the people from being heard. And we got so far away from the original goal that by 1876, the people's votes didn't even matter who they voted for president, because a group of 11 people, or 15 people, decided who was going to be president. And it's just, that was the lasting legacy of Reconstruction. So hypothetically speaking, if we're given a question on the final exam, was Reconstruction a failure or not? You decide. So I hope you enjoyed this. We will discuss this more during our Zoom meeting, and thanks for listening.